Dirty Secrets: How Chicago's Meat Industry Triggered a Revolution in Food Safety.
Due to the unsanitary practices that resulted in harmful meat products, the United States government was pressured into enacting the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 and the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. Until the mid-19th century, Chicagoans had always known where their meat came from. People bought their meat locally, where it was mostly cut and cleaned right in front of their eyes. They were aware of the quality of food they consumed and the conditions it was prepared in. During the early 1860s, when the Civil War began, the meat industry of Chicago saw significant economic growth. With the rising demand of meat factories during the Civil War, there was a need for new meatpacking headquarters. Chicago, with its central location, numerous railroad connections, and proximity to livestock from the Midwest, was chosen as the new headquarters. Unfortunately, with the rise in the number of meat factories, there also was a rise in neglect as well as deterioration in the administration and regulation of these upcoming packing houses. It was not until the 1890s and the beginning of the Progressive Era that the abhorrent and tragic conditions of these factories started coming to light. With no laws to enforce proper sanitation or food safety regulations, these packing houses were run in the most abominable ways. Workers' bodies that fell into lard vats were disintegrated, and meat that fell into toilets were then cut without cleaning.
We have to realize that the conditions in the factory were incredibly bad. There were no bathrooms for the men. Animals that fell on the floor would just be picked up and continue to be prepared.
Since much of the work involved tearing apart and cutting meat, blood and guts flowed everywhere. Workers stood all day in blood, contaminated water, bile, meat, skin, and excess chemicals. Laura Allen, a journalist, has written, "In those days, bovine tuberculosis was particularly common, and that could be passed to humans through milk or contaminated meat. Once the worker had it, they still could not stop working for fear of being out of a job or home, so they would spit blood onto the floor, coughing on other workers and on the meat, spreading the disease around. The ensuing lung infection often caused death." The smell from the meat processing attracted rats, flies, and other vermin. In order to keep them out, the factories were kept entirely closed, which provided no ventilation. In summer, the factories would get unbearably hot, which would make the place reek of rotten meat and sweat. In the winter, the low temperatures made the workers clumsy and their work all the more risky. Unsanitary facilities were not the only reason for the tragic conditions in the packing houses. With new innovations taking place all over the country, the use of machinery in these factories grew, and so did the number of injuries and fatalities. Hair, skin, blood, and even amputated limbs would sometimes get into the canned meat. The contents of these cans were shipped out without being examined. The horrendous working conditions, along with the hardships the meatpacking workers faced, caused unrest among the workers. The Chicago Meatpackers Union went on strike. The uproar from the strike brought a young novelist, Upton Sinclair, to Chicago. He intended to expose the injustices of the meat industry. He went undercover in these factories and interviewed factory workers and their families. Then, Sinclair fictionalized real accounts and wrote the book, The Jungle. The book depicted in detail the filthy and unsanitary conditions of the meat plants. In his book, The Jungle, Upton Sinclair wrote, "Jonas had told them how the meat that was taken out of pickle would often be found sour, and how they would rub it up with soda to take away the smell and sell it to be eaten on free lunch counters. Also, of all the miracles of chemistry which they performed, giving to any sort of meat, fresh or salted, whole or chopped, any color and any flavor and any odor they chose." The book became an overnight sensation and served as a wake-up call for the public. This caused an outcry and led to strikes against meat companies all over Chicago. These tragic conditions were disastrous not only to the factory workers, but also to the consumers. Many consumers got sick, and some even died from the consumption of the meat products from these factories. In 1889, during the Spanish-American War, Armour & Company sent a batch of meat products to the soldiers at the front. After consuming the meat, many soldiers became too ill to fight, and some even perished. As Sinclair's work became more widespread, it captured the attention of President Roosevelt. He invited Sinclair to discuss the challenges of the meat industry and ways to overcome them. He appointed special commissioners and ordered an investigation of the Chicago slaughterhouses. When the reports came back in the May of 1906, it was confirmed that all of the horrors depicted in the jungle were true. One of the special commissioners said, "A hog had just been cleaned, washed, and started on its way to the cooling room, fall from the sliding rail in the dirty wooden floor, and slid part way into a filthy men's privy." It became clear that the meat industry was in a dire need of reforms.
What happened after the publication of Sinclair's book, it sparked outrage across the country, starting in Washington with Theodore Roosevelt, who was then president, and who had seen the effects that spoiled meat could have on troops in the war. It sparked fierce opposition to the fact that people were being served this kind of meat.
As a result of President Roosevelt's efforts to resolve the challenges of the meat industry, the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 and the Meat Inspection Act of 1906 were passed. The passage of these regulations marked a turning point in federal food safety in the United States. The Pure Food and Drug Act focused on accurate food labeling. It outlawed interstate trading of adulterated and misbranded foods and required producers to indicate the presence of mixtures and/or impurities on food labels. It regulated food additives and prohibits misleading labeling of food and drugs. Any food was considered adulterated if it contained filthy or decomposed animal matter, poisonous or deleterious ingredients, or anything that attempted to conceal inferior components. Companies producing food and drugs could no longer make false claims or mislabel their products and deceive the public. An offending manufacturer or distributor could be prosecuted by the federal government. The Pure Food and Drug Act was a great success for the food consumers in the United States. With enforcement of this act, the food products sold in market were clean, pure, and contained only the ingredients listed on the label. The Second Food Safety Act, the Meat Inspection Act of 1906, was a companion measure to the Pure Food and Drug Act that tightened the oversight by the United States Department of Agriculture, or the USDA, on meat production. This act made it unlawful to adulterate or misbrand meat and meat products being sold as food, and ensured that meat was slaughtered and processed under sanitary conditions. It also mandated pre-mortem as well as post-mortem inspection of livestock.
So in our establishment, we have a USDA inspector that comes in every day. And what he does is walk around and make sure all of our paperwork is in order, that we're following our plans the way they are written, that we are cooking and chilling products to the correct temperatures, that our employees are following hygienic practices.
Under this law, standards for hygiene and sanitation for slaughterhouses and meat processing plants were set.
Employees have to have frocks and hairnets and gloves, need to follow sanitary practices of washing their hands before starting work, during work, how to handle food so you're not cross-contaminating between poultry and pork and beef.
Any meat products from plants that failed to meet these requirements were stopped from entering commerce.
Upton Sinclair's publication of the book was the spark that set off these changes and prompted the Pure Food and Drug Act as well as the Meat Inspection Act. Those things are in place today, and they continue to support our watchdogs in the government that from the FDA, the USDA, that are watching over the safety of our food.
No one can deny that we have come a long way in food safety from the days when there would be poison on the floor and workers' body parts in cans of food. Fortunately, it is safe to say that the tragedies of Chicago's meat industry of the late 19th century led us to the triumphant food laws that have since maintained their promise of guaranteeing quality of food and protecting the consumers.